The public relations people were great, but they were also kind of helpless because at the time the exchanges were membership organizations. They didn't feel obligated to go through some PR person, so it was quite different than a corporation. And from the point of view of the journalists, it was great because you could, cultivate sources, make friends with people, and then, if something happened, you'd call 20, 30 people and you'd find out everything.
How did you decide to get into journalism?
Oh, I wanted to be in journalism my whole life. I was the editor of my junior high school paper and my high school paper, and I went to journalism school at Northwestern, grad school in journalism, and then before you know it, I was covering futures. That was the real surprise. Andy Yemma, my good friend, who is, as you know, a big figure in the futures industry too, at the time he was the business editor of the Sun-Times, took a chance on me. I wasn't really a full-fledged reporter when I was hired there. It was kind of a glorified clerk who also wrote stories. And before you know it, I had a different beat. I was the retailing reporter, so I covered the department stores like Marshall Field's and Carson, Scott, Bolts and Sears and Montgomery. But that got old, and when I asked for a change, the premier beat at the Sun-Times was LaSalle Street.
What was it like covering the FBI's investigation of Chicago exchanges?
We went nuts for about 8 months, but honestly, the Tribune was completely different. They had everybody wanting to be on the story because it was their scoop. But for the Journal and the New York Times and me and the other wire services that covered the industry very extensively then, no one wanted to touch it. So I was pretty much on my own, along with a reporter named Charlie Nicodemus, who the two of us worked pretty hard. And there was a columnist named Art Patak, who was an organized crime columnist. And he wrote kind of a fantasy story that I think was semi-made up that the FBI told him. And that was really the only other person who worked on it.
Did this story help you learn about futures and options?
Right out of the box, I was barely on the beat. And next thing you know, I had to do a lot of catching up. But it was a real crash course. I learned so much about futures, and I'm grateful to, you mentioned Todd Cashman, but there were others too who were willing to take time to explain how the business worked to somebody like me who didn't know anything when I started. And it took about a year, honestly, to get up to speed and to understand how trading worked. I took a course at the options, they called it something different then, but it's essentially the options school that still exists at the CBOE, and read a bunch. And next thing you know, I was able to write coherent stories, but it took a good year.
When did you get a sense of the in-house competition in the CME?
Early on, they had at the time Jack Sander, Leo Melamed, and Bill Brodsky. Bill being the president at the time and CEO, and Jack and Leo were I think very close. And if I remember, Jack was a protege of Leo's, but they became very sort of bitter rivals in the sense that each wanted to be the main face of the market. And I can remember coming to Boca, where we are now, to the FIA conference, and having Jack Sander walk into a room. I was sitting in the back waiting for this panel to begin of exchange leaders. Jack looked at the panel, how it was set up, went up and took Leo's little name tag, the card that said Leo Muhammad, moved it all the way in and put his in the middle. And that was kind of how it was.
What was the competition like amongst the Board of Trade leaders?
Less personal, I'd say, although for me, Cash Malman always seemed like an interesting character to be leading the Board of Trade, just because it was a very Chicago institution. As you know, there were generations of families there. Almost everyone was practically born into the exchange. And Cash Malman, of course, was from Germany. I mean, he was quite an anomaly in some ways, but he was a very effective leader there, and I think well respected until things blew up for him too, for his trading firm. And Tom Donovan, as you know, was the president and CEO, and also really ran things in a more direct way than Bill had a chance to do at the CME, although we know Bill Brodsky very effective, allowed to be excellent leader of the CBOE, but he had to stay under the radar too, so as not to steal thunder from Jack and Leo. Whereas I think Tom Donovan had more authority at the Board of Trade to run things and get things done. Also a lot of pressure, when there was a flood in the loop and the Board of Trade had its basement filling up with water, Tom was the one who got the Chicago Fire Department to come and bail him out. Had a lot of connections.
What was the main story of the exchanges when you covered them?
Well, the real story of the exchanges then was their incredible growth and how they didn't feel legit. They had a chip on their shoulder. You were west of Wall Street. New York was really still the center of finance, but that was shifting. And the exchanges were very dynamic. They were launching new products. Options on futures were coming one after another. The CBOE was expanding too. And I can remember when the CBO 250 launched, it was a stock index. It was invented, and all the Board of Trade yellow badges, the full members, went over to trade it as a show of support. There must have been 300 people in a pit. And of course, it didn't catch on. It doesn't exist. It hasn't for decades. But at the time, it was pretty impressive. They could rally the troops and really make something go.
Do you remember some big stories or themes you wrote about at the Tribune?
Some of the funny ones were at the city. It was all still open outcry, and there used to be regular news releases of people who would get into trouble, and fighting was not uncommon. So there were fist fights. There was this one guy named Louis Borsellino who was famous in the S&P 500 pit for beating people who didn't trade with him, or who he felt were not respecting him, and I saw his name over and over and over, and the fines kept going up for fighting. I think eventually they fined him like $25,000 for some fight he had, which was way out of line compared to the normal fine for a fight. So I went and met him, and he turns out to be a really nice guy and really thoughtful. We kind of got friendly, and he just said that you got to stick up for yourself, and they don't like me down there, but they respect me. And at the time, he was like wagging his finger at me, and I thought, I wouldn't mess with this guy either. I do remember the night trading, which became a big deal at the Board of Trade. They wanted the Japanese market for treasuries, and so they opened these pits at night because they were doing everything they could to resist electronic trading. And really, the story of the 90s was the advent of electronic trading and how Globex caught on, and eventually, of course, overtook the open outcry pits and replaced it. The Board of Trade was very reluctant to sign on to anything that would disrupt locals and the brokers there who were, the members that ran the place. And the night trading was a way to try to bridge, some of what they were experiencing. And the night trading crowd was a whole different world. But there were some really experienced traders. One named Jim Hines, who is now being inducted into the FIA Hall of Fame, was very helpful at explaining how trading worked and how the bond market worked. So I can remember showing up at night at the end of the evening just to talk to Jim and to try to learn from him, as he was, like so many traders, really accommodating. And the other thing about traders was that they sort of had a reputation for being kind of a fast crowd. But the reality is that I could count on one hand the number of people who tried to mislead me or anything like that, which is not true of other industries I've covered. People really were honorable. They'd sometimes not tell you the whole story, but I didn't get lied to at all, and people were really pretty open. And I missed it. I really did. When I moved on, I became the business editor at the Tribune, and that was not as much fun.
Did you have favorites or people who loved to see their name in print?
Well, honestly, the ones who really loved it the most were, of course, people who were in charge and seeking the limelight, like Jack Zinder famously. But a lot of the people you might not expect, like the lawyers who represented the traders during the commodity sting, I got to be friends with them. And my God, they pick up the phone on the first ring if they knew what the Tribune was calling wherever it was, because it was good for their business. And it was more the people who sort of served the traders as opposed to most of the traders themselves.